Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Open Source and Public Policy panel. I think this is the first type of panel of this sort. This is a relatively new topic, and I'm grateful for your interest in the topic. My name is Deborah Bryant. I do policy work. I was at Red Hat leading their open source program office for 8 years. And some of the work I did there, including some support for UN projects and sustainability, kind of brought my heart back to wanting to do more public sector work again. So last spring, I began doing consulting work and helping software foundations with public policy. OSI is one of the groups that I work for, and I help them with US policy. I also do policy work for the Eclipse Foundation, and I've even collaborated on a project with Apereo. So with that, identifying myself, very briefly, I have a long background in open source that touches on multiple sectors. I was at Oregon State University's Open Source Lab, where we use that resource, that public resource, to enable like community projects. And I've learned a great deal about community. I was Oregon's Deputy State CO, where I got familiar with governance and policy making, including turning legislation into the rules and the practices that agencies had to adhere to meet the intent of policy. So that's where I got my feet wet in policy. And then more recently, as I mentioned, I worked for Red Hat. I was really privileged to probably have one of the better jobs for a non-technical person, role in open source, and have great lifelong friends I've made there and some I met before. Today, we're going to introduce you to a number of organizations that have historically not engaged in public policy. Earlier this year, I identified a need for a voice for open source community foundations, public benefit foundations, to be able to weigh in on sort of a tsunami of legislation we suddenly saw both in Europe and in the United States. Much of that was driven through concerns around cybersecurity, and not just for open source, proprietary as well. And also for emerging topics like AI and other concerns. And at the same time, we've seen a rise in an understanding of the benefits and the widespread adoption, a topic I've worked on for years, adoption of open source in government. So now that they're all in and understand the benefit, they also understand the responsibility and the gap in the need to support. So today I'm going to turn over an introductory from each of our panelists, and then we're hoping to leave a lot of room for conversation, especially because we'd like to hear how much awareness there is both to attending this conference and where we can help as we develop a roadmap for the Open Policy Alliance for the coming year. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Ruth Seeley, who's Executive Vice President of Apache Foundation.
Are we just going to intro now, or are we doing our whole?
Do your whole thing.
Okay. Hi, so as Deb mentioned, my name is Ruth Seeley. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Apache Software Foundation. I've been the Director of Open Source at SAS for about a year. Before that, I spent 15 years at Red Hat, 10 of them in the Open Source Program Office. I also helped launch and wrote a lot of the content early on for opensource.com, which I know a lot of folks here are familiar with. It's been a big partner of All Things Open for a long time. But here I'm mostly talking from the perspective of the ASF. So quick survey question. How many of you are not from the US? Okay, that's probably about what I thought. How many of you feel like you're pretty familiar with what the ASF is? Slightly fewer than I expected. Cool. So the Apache Software Foundation is a nonprofit that most people know of for the HTTPD server. And even if you're not sure what that means, even if you're not a software person, at some point in your life, you run into a website that says, you have successfully set up your Apache server. Now put some website content here. That was the original back in the late 90s, but now it's home to more than about 350 projects, I think, many of them pretty high profile, which we'll get into. 227 million lines of code, 630,000 contributors, about 9,500 committers. And I said last week at our event for the foundation that my goal that I adopted, I think as the words came out of my mouth on stage, is that next year for the 25th anniversary, we should hit the 10,000th contributor mark, or committer mark. I think that would be really cool. Yay, Steven's on board with me. Are you a committer? Do you want to be?
Tell me what my kids are going to do next semester.
Oh, I like that. So he's a professor. He said, tell me what my students are going to do next semester. We'll add some to the list. So what others of you perhaps are more familiar with is this little situation that came up a couple years ago now around something called Log4j. Those words sound familiar? Maybe even if you didn't know what the ASF was 3 minutes ago, you heard those words in some news article somewhere. So Log4j is a popular logging library, as the name implies, used in a lot of Java applications by, as we later told the federal government, kind of pretty much everyone everywhere. And so a lot of people think of this as having happened in 2021, but in fact, I wrote down the timeline this morning because now this is all getting to be a hazy, fuzzy memory. In July of 2013, a feature patch was added for JNDI lookup plugin support. So if you had an app using Log4j after 2014 and logged something that an untrusted user provided with a default configuration, you could then end up executing untrustworthy code. So that was actually 10 years ago. First non-beta release went out in 2014. Fast forward to November 24th, 2021. And a vulnerability was reported to various ASF parts, triggered our vulnerability handling process, and I'll go back to that in a second. The next day is Thursday, November 25th, and if that date sounds significant, it's because that was Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving Day is when all of this happened. Meetings happened to discuss the issue and the fixes. The CVE request went out the next day on the 26th. The PMC, so the way the Apache Software Foundation works, everything is structured in project management committees, PMCs, that is what our projects are called. So the PMC had a proposed fix by the 29th, a few days later, started their 72-hour voting process on a new release candidate, and then December 9th, which, what's that, about 2 weeks later, exploits started to be posted on Twitter. Probably most significantly, at least to the teenagers in my house, was the Minecraft one. Cloudflare also reported an exploitation with the date of December 9th, but it turned out that they actually had probing going back to December 1st, and that was probably the earliest that we're aware of exploitation on Log4j. So December 10th, our security team pushed out their update, revised the CVSS score to a 10. In retrospect, probably a 9.8, but you don't revise in retrospect. Sent out announcements, the CVE was live, the whole jam, CSET, everybody else published their announcements. And then January rolls around, and now several federal entities want to have a little conversation about what has just happened. And so a lot of people have come to see Log4j as this wake-up moment. And it certainly was not the first instance of a significant security vulnerability in open source software. I'm sure you can all think of at least 3 more off the top of your head right now. And a lot of things that we're going to talk about in this public policy area had already started rolling by then, but I think for a lot of folks, this was the moment, and I joke, but there's a lot of truth in this. Open source won and ran the world for, depending on where we draw the line, let's say conservatively 15 years. And then all the other people who were not us woke up one morning in 2021 and went, oh crap, wait, where's that come from? Who did that? Who uses it? What is it? And they didn't have answers to that. And that was really alarming to regulators and policymakers around the world. So the ASF went and testified before a Senate committee. It's very exciting to get legal advice when basically everybody on the planet is using the software in question. So we had to go to them and explain all of this from zero. So when I tell all of you, this is going to sound super boring. I'm just going to tell you what we told the Senate. Software developed in the ASF is made available at no cost and without warranty. That's not news to any of you. Under a license permitting commercial modification and reuse without notification, many commercial products include ASF software. All of this is fresh news. That is simply life fact to probably everyone in this room, but that is fresh news to anyone who is making policy. And then we go on and explain how the projects act, that our PMCs are independent, what a PMC is, that they set their own technical processes, but that we have foundation-wide policies and processes that worked when this happened. There was a specific process that should work, and they gave us high fives, metaphorically speaking, on how we had handled this specific vulnerability. But they had bigger concerns about who's making this software, who's using this software, and what happens the next time. So around January, February, then the Department of Commerce released a report. So for those of you who are in Europe, I have learned a lot, and we'll get to the CRA, about how very differently the US and Europe work. But one thing we have in common is about 11 billion organizations who all have an opinion about everything and often don't talk to each other. But the Department of Commerce released its report and said, well, open source software has a very basic challenge. There's not one single responsible entity. And then at the back of the sentence, they complain that they don't want any one single corporation to have too much control. But so on the surface, sure, that's true. Like, there's no one single responsible entity when there's 600,000 contributors, right? But in the case of the ASF, we are a central curator for those 300 some odd projects with common and consistent processes when things like this happen, for code signing, for all of that process I just described. There is this curator for all of this. It's not just the Wild West of where does the software come from. So I think that this was in a lot of ways the wake-up call, except I said, so this started sort of November of 2021, but back in May of that year was when the executive order in the US came out. How many of you hear those words at work and you're still not entirely sure sometimes what they mean, but people keep saying executive order a lot and think you should do something about it. I see a lot of nodding happening, right? Oh yeah, yes, that. So a big result of that has been SBOMs. And for those of you who have not had the joy of hearing this word for the last 2 years, or acronym as the case may be, that's a software bill of materials. And the easiest way that I know of to explain this is with Legos. If you've ever built a set of Legos, in the back of it, there is a set of pages that say there is one 1x1 blue piece. There are 4 3x2 yellow pieces. That is a bill of materials that happens in physical products throughout the world. But for some reason, we never did that for software. And now we are going to do that for software. And there are many vendors upstairs with booths that would like to talk to you about how they can help you with your SBOM needs. So that came about in May. SBOMs themselves don't generally notify you of a vulnerability because they're that ingredient list. It's more like when you buy a package of crackers and then somebody realizes that the wheat field was infested with something terrible that's going to make you sick and they recall it. They're not going to go change the ingredients list on that package of crackers. That is still fact. It just tells you that you experienced the bad wheat field. I'll work on my metaphors one day, I swear. Along in 2022, a group came together in the US, the Open Source Software Security Initiative, OS3I for slightly shorter. And then in March of this year, we got the National Cybersecurity Implementation Plan. So a lot of this has been happening fairly quickly in terms of government timelines. A lot of it is coming from another organization called CISA, and they have an RFI that has been extended through November 8th, which if you're not familiar with it, and I think Greg might talk a little more about this. You can talk about the RFI?
No.
Sweet. A lot of people have heard it as the memory safe languages problem, and that's what they read in this RFI, but it actually asks a lot of other questions. So that is, in fact, point 1 in this request for input from CISA is about reducing the proliferation of memory unsafe programming languages, but I read it as wanting to know what we as foundations can do and what the open source ecosystem can do, because the rest of the questions are, how should the federal government contribute to driving down the most important systemic risks in open source software? I don't like that sentence. How can the federal government help foster the long-term sustainability of open source software communities? I'm a big fan of anybody who wants to help with our sustainability. And how should open source software security solutions be implemented from a technical and resourcing perspective? So those are all really solid questions that I hope some of you have companies that are answering this RFI, and I'm sure many of the other organizations represented here and in the room are as well. On the other side of the ocean this year, starting back in September of last year, September of 2022, a lot of people felt a little blindsided by this thing, the CRA. So how many of you nods, you've heard those letters? The Cyber Resilience Act in the EU. So see, this is when we could have had slides. I had sort of the problematic chunk of the CRA on a slide, because when you look at it, it looks reasonably friendly. It says something about how open source doesn't count. That's not the words it uses, but it looks on the surface like open source is an exception. But in reality, it describes it as commercial participation, and it's very unclear on what that means. And while you and I all know that if you make sandwiches at Subway all day and then go home at night and contribute to an open source project, you are not exactly a corporate contributor. Subway has no interest in that thing that you did on GitHub last night. It's not 100% clear in the CRA that there is any distinction between that and what all of you get paid to do. So that is a dramatic example, but since failure to comply could result in fines of 15 million euros, it's kind of worth figuring it out. And many organizations see this as a, not to be dramatic, but it's worth being dramatic, existential threat to open source software. This is a huge deal, and it's not entirely clear also at this point how much more we can do about it. And so multiple foundations this year have done what they can. The Eclipse Foundation and some others signed on to an open letter. And I'm going to read you what that said because I think it really makes the point. Open source software represents more than 70% of the software present in products with digital elements in Europe, and honestly, I think that number is probably low. Our community does not have the benefit of an established relationship with the co-legislators. With a CRA, more than 70% of the software in Europe is about to be regulated without an in-depth consultation. I'm hoping, I'm an optimist, so I'm hoping for the best, and I suspect other folks here may have other things to say, but it's not looking good, and there's not a lot we can do about it. And so the ASF has not historically been deeply involved in public policy, and I think Deb was going to talk a little more about the difference between lobbying and what we can do as foundations. But this year we did create a new role. So I've heard people joke many times that the ASF is full of vice presidents. We have them for everything, but that is how we assign responsibility. It is not that you are wholly responsible, but you go find a team of folks to help you for all those things that are not software projects. And so this summer we created a vice president of public policy role. And his name is Dirk. He is based in Europe. And so he has been working a lot with those policymakers in Europe and talking about the CRA and what a huge effect it is going to have, not just in Europe, but globally if it passes. So I'm using lots of the words in time, so I'm going to pass it on to Greg.
Thank you. Hey everybody, my name is Greg Wallace, and I am the Director of Partnerships and Research at the FreeBSD Foundation. And so basically what that means is I work with the commercial, mostly the commercial, but not exclusively, the downstream ecosystem of users of FreeBSD. And my job is to really help them be successful with FreeBSD, and part of that is helping them to get involved upstream. We have a lot of companies that use FreeBSD who are super involved upstream, and then quite a few who use it and aren't involved at all. And so a lot of my work is to just explain to them the benefit of being involved upstream. But part of what it means for me to help companies be successful with FreeBSD is to help them understand the implications of new policies and regulations. And so that's kind of what's brought me to this panel and why I'm very grateful for OSI and for Deb for putting together the OPA, because it's only a small part of my job, and we're a pretty small foundation, so it's really great for me to have partners that I can bounce ideas off of and learn from. So I guess I'd like to give a quick overview of FreeBSD, and then I'm going to talk about the things that we're focused on with policy. Before I do that though, before hearing me just introduce myself, who here has heard of FreeBSD? Awesome, I love it. All right, who here uses FreeBSD now or has used FreeBSD? Okay, still a lot. Keep your hands up, keep your hands up. Now, if your hand isn't up and you have a PlayStation, please raise your hand. Okay, how about an iPhone?
I was going to ask if the Apple products counted.
Okay, and Netflix subscription? Okay, so FreeBSD is really ubiquitous, and that's just kind of a fun way to point that out. But it isn't as well known as some of the other open source projects, and so that's part of what I do is kind of help raise awareness. So what is FreeBSD? FreeBSD is an open source operating system. It is not a Linux distro. It came out in '93 and is derived from Berkeley Unix. And it's a complete operating system, and it's licensed under a permissive license. So I come by our booth, it's like right over there if you want to learn more. It's also a global community of developers, and we have a foundation. So the foundation is a 501c3, so we're a public charity, and we only do one thing, which is work to make FreeBSD as good as it possibly can be and support the community and the work that they do. So most of the donations that we bring in go into development. We have a few developers on staff, and we have a bunch of contractors that we work with. So as it relates to policy, really we're focused on two things. One is this RFI, and there has been, and I think there is going to continue to be, I almost think of it as a tsunami of regulation that's coming down. Governments around the world are super concerned about security and want to make software as secure as it can be. And there are a lot of organizations within governments in the US and around the world that are putting things out. So, one of the things that we're working on to help our users with is something that the NIST has put out called the Secure Software Development Framework. So that's going to mean any organization that licenses or sells software to the US government has to submit a report that says that software was built according to the Secure Software Development Framework practices. And it's for your software as a company and any open source software that you include. So this is going to come into effect next year. So that's an example. There's the CRA, and then there's just a whole host of different things. So when I saw this RFI, I was really encouraged, because to me, that was a signal from the US government that they really wanted to hear from open source users and from the open source community, from foundations, on what the government could do to encourage and be helpful in making open source more sustainable and more secure. So really wanting to help. So that's an area that I've been talking to Deb quite a bit about, and some others. And we are looking at, there's this stat that everybody has now seen that Sonatype put out, that 96% of all code bases have open source. So that means that 96% or more of all companies that are bidding for government contracts, digital contracts, use open source. But we all know that not 96% of companies that use open source support open source equally, right? So how can the government encourage companies to support the open source that they use? So that's something that I'm interested in and we're working on as part of this response to the RFI. And then the other area that I work on is connecting the experts in the FreeBSD community with policymakers. And this is one of the ways that the OPA is so valuable and helpful. So I'll give you one quick example and then I'll pass the mic. So there's been a 10+ year long research program led by a member of the FreeBSD Foundation Board of Directors. His name's Robert Watson, and he's a computer science professor at the University of Cambridge. And he's been working on this thing called CHERI, which stands for Compatibility Hardware Enhanced Risk Instructions. And basically what it is a way to protect against memory safety vulnerabilities in hardware. So Rust is great, don't get me wrong, and any new systems app should be written in Rust. But what about the millions of apps out there in the wild today written in C, C++? You're not going to rewrite all of them into Rust. That's too expensive. And so by modifying 1% or fewer of the lines of code in any of these apps, you can run it on CHERI hardware and be instantly protected against 70% of the memory safety vulnerabilities. And there's a very, almost no performance hit. So you can get this now through ARM Morello boards. They're development boards that are in limited supply. And then there are some boards from Microsoft for RISC-V to test out. So, and this is something that policymakers are starting to include in their recommendations. We saw this from a blog recently from CISA. So that's sort of what I do, and if anybody has any questions, I'm in the booth right over there, or you can catch me after the panel.
Oh, the wire needs a pull. I'm Steve Jacobs. I run something called Open at RIT, which is the second OSPO in an academic institution, except we don't call ourselves an OSPO. We call ourselves an open programs office that supports all open work across the university, because universities do much more than software. By getting funded by the Sloan Foundation to start doing this work 3 years ago, I started getting much more involved, not just in the open source policy that these folks have been talking about, but also looking at what the federal government and other folks are doing around open science, like the nice NASA lady talked to us about yesterday, and around what happens within academia. And I'm going to try to blitzkrieg Bob through a huge list of stuff that Deb has links to for y'all. But Also mentioning that sonotype study, since I teach kids community contribution, it's significant to me that that sonotype says that only 11% of projects are maintained, and that 1 in 8 has downloadable vulnerabilities as part of the package. So these are kind of important things. Where policy comes in at the university level, on an internal level first, is that lots and lots of faculty, staff, and students produce or contribute to open source. The university as an entity has no idea what it is, where it's going, what to do with it. This makes them nervous. There are really 3 different categories of people under that corporate umbrella. At my institution, and some, but certainly not all universities, students own their IP, right? So they can do whatever they want. So that's just the way it is. We try to educate them about what their options are and what good behavior is in that space. Staff do whatever policy says at a university, just like they all do whatever policy says within your corporations, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, grin. And then faculty are this weird mutant category, because faculty are by and large encouraged or are self-motivated to share their work. It's part of what you do in a federally funded university, and 88% of science is funded federally. But the university and you probably also really like it if you can make money off of what you do. And universities don't know, by and large, how to do that with open source. They don't know what to do with open source. They don't have policies around open source. My university still doesn't have policy on it, because getting academic policy is like getting a camel through the eye of a needle. Is that the saying that we use? So we have best practices on the OpenRIT website, and we keep nudging people that maybe this should be policy someday, right? So that's on the inside of what universities do, and that's a much bigger category that other conversations can be had about later on. In terms of federal policy and science, the federal government is just starting to figure this out. Kind of a key bellwether indication that they're finally thinking about it is that, who's heard of the National Science Foundation if you're in the US, right? So they write big checks. They've been writing big checks for academics to develop platforms for open science, software that other scientists can use to do science. They woke up, and even if they've been requiring that stuff, if it's federally funded, it should be open and freely distributable. Only within the last 3 years has the National Science Foundation said, oh, community. It seems that when we give people money to make a thing, and then that money runs out, often the thing falls apart. Why is that? So they have just started a grant channel called POSE. The NSF loves their acronyms, so they couldn't say Pathways to Open Source Community, because that would be POSC, and that's not a great acronym. Policy for federally funded efforts for many years. They have recently ramped that up to be much more stringent. So the NIH is the one that's got the toughest policy at the moment, but everybody else is kind of following along. What happened is that policy went out, and the Office of Science and Technology Policy under the White House came out with a memo that changed a lot of how the federal government funds science and technology research. So before, they said, okay, only some of the agencies will have to enforce openness. And when we enforce openness, we give people a year-long embargo after they publish before they distribute, right? So they can have a head start on everybody else. There was something called the Nelson Memo that came out 18 months ago, and they basically said everybody, and it's not just science, right? This is NEA for the National Endowment for the Arts, this is NEH for the humanities, which uses lots of open source stuff like R, right? If you are doing federally funded work from any agency, it has to be open, at least the data, if not the whole product, depending on what the agency says. And as soon as you publish, your data has to be out there. NIH says that you have to have a 3-page, intensely detailed data policy and plan with your proposal, not after you get the money figured out, right? These are folks who are mostly not coders. They're not aware of technology. They now have to start talking about, well, here are the data file formats, and here's the repositories they're going to be in, and here's how we're going to maintain them, and before they even get anywhere near the opportunity to get funded to make what they make. This is all a very big change. These efforts that these folks have mentioned already for federal government policy, the federal government is trying to figure out lots and lots of stuff. Lots and lots of people are trying to help them. So you heard the acronym RFI, Request for Information, mentioned by fine folks to my right. Those are usually very detailed, intricate, you gotta be in the know kind of documents, right? Flip side, the Foundation of American Scientists, the FAS, the Center for Open Science, which produces a lot of tools and platforms for the distribution of science, and the Wilson Foundation, which is a federal government think tank / lobbying / whatever, depends on who you ask who they are. The three of them have put together literally a crowdsourcing effort for the next 10 years of open science at the federal level. There is a 1-page website with 4 boxes. You can't write more than 1,000 words for all of the boxes. And they say, what's your idea for policy for open science for the next 10 years? What do you think is important? Why is it important? We're going to collect all this stuff till October 23rd, and then we're going to munge it all together and try to find merges and forks that work. And then we're going to have a convening where we call all the people who had ideas we like to get together and create an omnibus package of policy for science and research from the federal government. So this is, you guys have influenced just through your practices, even though arguably science was open source before technology was open source, right? That's changed through academic journals. That's another 3 hours in a bar some other time. But these are the things that I'm touching on, and the folks like me who have open source programs offices funded by the Sloan Foundation, by people who are faculty and researchers who work in areas that touch policy regulation. They're all trying to figure this out. They can all use your help. And that's where I'm going to leave it for now, so Patrick gets a chance.
Thank you. So my name is Patrick Masson. I'm with the Apereo Foundation, and I've been working at the intersection of higher education and open source, of course, scary to say out loud, about 30 years, including roles as CIO within the State University of New York, CTO at the University of Massachusetts, General Manager at the Open Source Initiative, and now Executive Director at the Apereo Foundation. The Apereo Foundation, with apologies to Ruth, as I'm about to say this, other than Anne-Marie, who has heard of the Apereo Foundation before? A few people, thank you. I've been explaining that the Apereo Foundation is sort of like the Apache Foundation for higher education.
I'm good with that.
Thank you. So we are the only organization whose mission is specifically to raise awareness, adoption, and development of open source software in higher education. That's not to say that other organizations are not developing open source software for higher ed. That's definitely happened. Yesterday I was speaking with Dave McAllister, I don't know if he's here, from NGINX, and he had a great line. Open source will be successful when no one cares about it. And in higher education, open source must be very successful. Last week, I was at EDUCAUSE, and do folks know EDUCAUSE? they're the .edu domain administrators. So if you go to ucla.edu, suny.edu, umass.edu, they're the domain administrators for that. And they also have a large 1,200 plus university professional community focused on ed tech. And as I was walking through the organization, I was trying to get a sense of all the issues that are going on that we're all talking about. The impact of OER, open educational resources, on open source within higher education. The policies that are going, the emergence of the academic OSPO, all the issues that I was going to talk about that other folks already took care of for me.
You're welcome.
Thank you. And I would ask IT leaders on campuses, they don't really use open source, we're in the cloud. So there's a lack of appreciation, awareness about the prevalence of open source, and thus the impact of all these issues that we're talking with higher ed. And so rather than go over these things again, what Apereo wants to do is we're reaching out to our community, and we have a large community, global community. We work with the Axis group, which is EDUCAUSE's equivalent in Japan. We're working with the French ISU Portail, organizations in Europe and globally to raise awareness about these issues. But the challenge has been that, again, they don't appreciate how much they're soaking in it. I don't know if there's anyone in here as old as me. Marge, you're soaking in the palm olive. No one knows that commercial. But they're soaking in it. So Apereo Foundation is interested in developing a study. And if anyone's interested, we'd be happy to work with you. I'm hoping the folks on the stage will be interested in this way for publicly calling them out without actually making them to commit anything. And quickly, a four-part project. The first is to actually, with the help of EDUCAUSE, hopefully, and some other organizations, reach out to the higher ed IT leaders to get their current perception of open source on campus, self-reporting what they're doing. The second is actually to query the .edu domain, hit the ports to see what they're running. Find a statistically relevant set of campuses spanning the R1 community colleges of different types within the .edu domain and see what open source they're actually running. Next is to query with Bitergia's help and hopefully GitHub's help, review the open source development happening from .edu, again, repositories or contributors. And last, look at the jobs that are being posted within higher education looking for open source skills. They're looking for Python developers, Kubernetes administrators, capture all that information. Then we can go back to the higher ed community and share with them actually how much open source that they're using, how much open source that they're developing, and how much open source their support they're relying on and from who, in order to help them understand. So that's a sort of project to help us introduce, in the long run, these policies and create more active and engaged community who can help us in the higher ed group. And that's as fast as I could possibly say.
This is really challenging because we hope we could have the lion's share of time to talk with you, but in reality, there's just so much going on. There's so much to unpack in the first discussion. So very briefly, I'm going to answer this question in case it comes later. How can you get involved? OSI is hosting and leading the Open Policy Alliance initiative. That's kind of my baby this year. It's one of our most important initiatives, along with the project to define open source AI, which we'll be talking about later this afternoon. Becoming a member is meaningful. OSI's been for a long time, so it's really easily taken for granted. It's institutional plumbing for open source, so don't take it for granted. Take time to find out what they're doing contemporarily. Be a member, be a sponsor to help fund the OSI is really important. Then on the policy side, we have a public policy mailing list. Just ask any of us. I'll be around after the session when you talk.